Good afternoon! My name is Brad Trammell, and I don't want to waste your time by telling you that Funko Pops are bad because they're for Marvel-watching soy beta cucks. Okay, maybe I'll be saying some version of that, but everyone already knows that's the case. Besides, Funko Pops aren't the cause of our problems, but are instead a perfectly illustrated symptom. That's why for today's report, I want to use Funko Pops as a skeleton key to unlock even bigger questions, like what's behind our cultural obsession with nostalgia? Why does it feel like there's nothing new happening? How has entertainment fandom become a political identity? And what the heck is going on with men? How has masculinity become defined by either infantilizing yourself or cosplaying as a kitschy traditionalist? If we listen closely, Funko Pops can tell us the answers to all these questions and more. So join me as we gaze into the beady little eyes of the decline of Western civilization. This is the Funko Report. Chapter 1, A Brief History of Funko. The story of Funko's rise to becoming one of the biggest toy companies in the world started in Washington State in the year 1988 when a salesman named Mike Becker became co-workers with an artist named Rob Schwartz. The two became fast friends over their shared nostalgia for 1950s pop culture. After work, the duo spent the early 90s obsessing over things like muscle cars, hotel signs, tiki bars, basically all things kitschy Americana. Their retro obsession was part of a broader theme of the time. Everything from the most popular films to radio-friendly music to iconic advertisements all referenced America's post-war golden age. Even the most subversive shows on Nickelodeon used the 1950s style patriarch, while that same network scored their biggest ratings hit of the decade by airing reruns of I Love Lucy. In fact, the first toy Rob and Mike made together was a throwback to 1950s drive-ins when they made a big boy bobblehead for the restaurant that sold out in a single day. The success of this experiment inspired the co-workers to start their own business called Funko, a combination of the words fun and company. Mike Becker used the connections he had as a salesman to secure licensing deals so they could manufacture even more bobbleheads of popular 1950s characters like Betty Boop. I think what's most important about the origins of Funko is that from day one, they weren't attempting to create their own original characters. It was always licensed nostalgia from the start. Of course, licensing is much more cost-effective than taking a chance on inventing new characters from scratch. In this way, Funko's founders were less artists than they were savvy businessmen who used the nostalgic zeitgeist of the 90s to revisit well-known characters through a bobblehead format that all recalled the 1950s. Funko Pop's origins are the perfect example of what Mark Fisher called the slow cancellation of the future, the idea that we're now stuck endlessly repeating formal strategies of the past. From the consumer side, the reason Fisher said we're so attracted to things that look like the past is because neoliberalism's destruction of solidarity and security has created a hunger for anything that feels well-established or familiar. So while you might not know which of your 5 freelance jobs is going to pay you this month, and you might not remember any of the 5,000 images you mindlessly scrolled through on Instagram today, you can at least buy a 1950s halftone comic book-inspired Funko Pop as a source of aesthetic stability. In a chaotic world, we look to consumer products as a warm security blanket, finding comfort in the idea that some things will always stay the same. What's so effective about Funko Pops in this way is that they create a kind of hall of mirrors of nostalgia that makes it difficult to tell what part of the past is even bringing you comfort. Take this 2018 Funko Pop of Iron Man as an example. Iron Man the comic book was made by Stan Lee in 1963, which was a way of technologically updating the Middle Ages. The first Marvel movie was then released in 2008 and has been remade every year since then. So, to summarize, a character from the 60s made to reference the Middle Ages was rebooted in the aughts, franchised in the teens, then licensed by a company from the 90s made to look like a toy from the 1950s, resulting in a product that contains traces of all these previous eras at once. The idea of the slow cancellation of the future could just as easily be called the inability to represent the present, because after all, if you can't understand the time in which you exist, then there's really no way to separate your own time from any time that came before it. This is why if you ask any person to define a decade, the first thing they'll typically point to are its cultural producers. People will say, oh, the 1950s were beatniks and rock and roll, the 1960s were hippies and Motown, the 1970s were punks and disco. Changes in culture serve as a shorthand for our understanding of the progress of time itself. So why is it that these changes no longer seem to happen, that we're always looking backwards? where are all the new things? The problem is, we've undergone a political transformation that's fundamentally hostile to the production of new culture. This includes everything from austerity cuts to grants for the arts, privatized education leading to massive student debt, as well as police and real estate developers working hand in hand to eliminate any type of unsanctioned exhibition space, music venue, or dance club. There's really not much free time to create new things when you're constantly competing in a job market of unpaid internships where you have to go 6 figures into debt to be able to compete in the first place. This leaves people who create culture with 2 options. The first is that you can quit under the pressure of precarity to go find a separate job, which unfortunately a lot of talented people are forced to do. This thinning of the herd that occurs from ages 22 to 30 leaves everything from art to music to film to fashion chock full of uninspired rich kids who are immune from such pressure. People who have no real ambition to create anything new because all they wanted was the romantic social life that being around culture provides. The other option you have is to take your talents and participate in the production of global homogeneity that neoliberalism offers us. And hey, it's not so bad. There's all types of opportunities available to be a creative. You can make the flat illustration for the startup that sells teenagers' blood. You can make the figurative identity painting for the money laundering gallery. You can make the clap and stomp music for the TV show about diversity in Ivy League country clubs. You can make the Etsy sweaters that memorialize RBG as a dope gangsta. Or you can even work on the 14th installment of a Marvel film about a neurodivergent superhero struggling with imposter syndrome. But if the thing you want to create isn't part of this global homogeneity program, then what it means is that you're going to have to invent not only your artwork from scratch, but also your own source of income too, which is understandably a tall order. What this has done is invert the relationship between youth and newness. The younger and more precarious an artist is, the more they're incentivized to participate in global homogeneity as a way to give themselves a foothold in an unforgiving market. This situation is kind of counterintuitive because we've always been taught that what is culturally new will somehow come from the youth because their perspective hasn't been polluted by the traditions of the past. But the market reality is that young people are now more likely to create some of the most traditional looking, globally homogenous culture around because they lack the stability to risk doing anything else. One of the newer ideas Funko had as a company was to create yearly meetups for their collectors called Funko Fun Days, which served as a safe space where their most die-hard fans could proudly nerd out and bond over collecting retro children's toys together. This was the initiation process where they transcended being mere collectors and leveled up to become Funko fanatics. These fanatics received limited edition toys. They were treated to nostalgic cereal brands for breakfast. They were entertained by the founders doing skits that referenced their favorite cartoons and even took photos in an early selfie booth posed as Funko Pops themselves. It was a summer camp for adults. You have to remember, back in 2002, tropes that are now familiar to us, like the adult Disneyland attendee or adults playing Pokemon Go in public, were relatively uncommon at the time, and the few public figures who engaged in this type of Peter Pan behavior were thought of as being wacko. The creation of the fanatic marks a shift in the slow cancellation of the future, where we went from buying products stuck in the past to normalizing entire lifestyles dedicated to nostalgia. This is why the fanatic is quite possibly Funko's most enduring and profitable creation. And it isn't even a product, it's a consumer identity. Chapter 2, the Funko consumer. The thing that always confused me about Funko Pops was how their consumers could actually like the way they look. Holding a Funko Pop in your hand really makes you understand just how cheaply produced these things are, whether it's the visible plastic seams underneath or the unfinished paint. This is why Funko Pops need their boxes, because if you display just one bear toy alone, it reveals itself to be a piece of plastic garbage. But if you assemble a grid of them as boxes, as their modular shape suggests, then they might appear to be a whole greater than the sum of their parts. It's a pretty brilliant strategy for getting consumers to buy their products in bulk, and they do. But beyond my own aesthetic hangups, it always confused me why Funko Pop's target demographic of fanatics weren't equally put off by the toy's melon-shaped heads. By standardizing the way every Funko Pop's face appears, it has the effect of softening any major differences in their identities, while also anonymizing the characters to look less like themselves. In many cases, the only way you can actually identify what character you're looking at is through the toy's packaging. For instance, who is this? Is it Mark Maron or Dennis Butsikaris or Guillermo del Toro? I assumed fanatics would consider any alteration made to canonical figures to be sacrilegious. So why do fanatics love the way these ugly little things look so much? One way to look at it is to think of Funko Pop's distortion as a feature, not a defect. That the reason Funko Pops are able to abstract their famous characters beyond recognition is because the Funko Pop isn't meant to convey anything about the character inside that box. What Funko Pops are meant to convey are the interests of their fanatic owner. In other words, Funko Pops are made for people who are fans of being fans of things. They're made for people who view their fandom of entertainment franchises as being a key element of their identity. Funko Pop's distortion offers a world where fandom for all things is equal, where the love of any one entertainment franchise is just as valid as any other, because there isn't a hierarchy of which collectible is the most detailed or the rarest or the largest. Every Funko is equally sized, equally distorted, equally valid. Thus, once again, fanaticism is measured through quantity, not quality. What is standardized about Funko Pop's appearance allows for the idiosyncrasies of their owner's taste to appear completely normal. When they're displayed as a grid, each box comes together, almost like a pixel would, to create a media consumption portrait of the fanatic who bought them. For me, the key to understanding fanatics as a consumer identity required me to update the way I thought about entertainment fandom. So in my traditional understanding of fandom, I thought of it as a kind of private obsession, a type of unrequited love between the fan and the object of their devotion. Like a poster of a heartthrob on a teenager's wall, fandom was experienced most intensely in the privacy of your own bedroom. In this way, there was almost some shame associated with being too big a fan of something, a kind of embarrassment that the thing you were privately obsessing over was in some way antisocial. Think of the concerned mom poking her head in the bedroom to say, "Why don't you stop painting those Warhammer figurines for a little bit and go outside and play basketball with the rest of the kids for a little while?" After all, being a sports fan was always considered acceptable. There was almost a sense of nobility in being a lifelong fan of a sports team, that you never wavered in your fandom since childhood. Being a sports fan was thought of to be a way of showing civic pride, both because of the huge groups of people sports bring together on a weekly basis, but also because of the pride a successful sports team brings to its city, the downtown parades, the signs of the city limit, the school assemblies, the beloved mascots. If entertainment fandom was thought to be a private form of consumption, then sports fandom was more encouraged because it was a social activity that brought the community together. But what we've seen in the past few decades have been massive changes in entertainment fandom that have made it a lot more like what sports fandom has always been. Being an entertainment fan today is an outwardly social identity. The message boards, chat rooms, and comment threads of the 90s morphed into the Reddit threads, Facebook groups, and Twitter stan culture we're all so familiar with. Of course, these entertainment communities aren't just digital. Fans meet in person all the time through conventions and meetups like Funko Fun Days. The irony being that many of these entertainment conventions are now so large, they now take place in the exact same arenas as sports events. Even dating apps emphasize users' entertainment fandom as an opportunity to hook up in person. But the reason this pipeline from digital fandom to real-world social ties is effective is precisely because it doesn't require excessively large groups to warrant an in-person meeting between fans. There is no entertainment fandom too niche or too obscure to not warrant its own community. And there is no entertainment fandom too taboo to remain private, because those fans know that at the meetup, they'll finally be among people who share the same interests. The other aspect of this is that the entertainment industry has become endless in the same way that sports seasons have always been endless. Today's most popular entertainment isn't created as a standalone product, but rather as part of an ongoing franchise. And the thing about franchises is that they never end. This is why we don't really have one-hit wonders anymore. We have pop stars who we're introduced to as children, and then we see for the rest of our lives thanks to the massive production teams that keep the momentum of their initial success going forever. It's expected that popular TV shows will go on for at least 10 or more seasons, or spin off, or just go on forever. Even TV shows that have ended now enjoy second lives as episode recap podcasts. Movie franchises are so expansive they're described in terms of being their own universes parallel to our own. The ongoing nature of entertainment franchises is what allows them to be used so effectively as part of our ongoing social media identities. It's not a coincidence that our mass fixation on identity has coincided with our mass adoption of social media. After all, social media compels each and every one of us to fixate on our identity by presenting ourselves as a kind of daily franchise, a main character of our own cinematic universe. Entertainment franchises factor into this because, while people used to just consume things and keep it to themselves, we now need to perpetually broadcast ourselves in a way that forces us to view every mundane interest we have as a potential opportunity for public display. No personal detail or private thought is safe from this never-ending demand for new content, especially the things you love the most. And like everything else, our beloved franchise entertainment isn't immune from the politicizing effects of America's equally endless culture war. To present yourself as a supporter of a specific entertainment franchise on social media is really no different from presenting yourself as a supporter of a political candidate or any other form of co-opted cultural representation. Generally speaking, to be a fan of blockbuster franchise entertainment is to be a fan of the propaganda wing of liberalism itself. Conservatives aren't paranoid to believe that Hollywood entertainment is imbued with liberal ideology. It is, just not the type they usually point to. They're movies that present billionaires as protagonists, positioning them as the rightful guardians of our collective morality. They're movies where the military and police can always be relied on as benevolent allies. They're movies where representative diversity is used as a marketing ploy to deliver the same creatively conservative narrative as always. They're movies where antagonists are tautologically evil because they're evil, and where evil can always be conveniently isolated to a single bad actor. The fact that the stars of these franchises unanimously serve as celebrity surrogates for the Democrat Party is just the cherry on top of what was already a strong alliance between the two. Today, entertainment has been aestheticized along the lines of the culture war, and our position as being a hater or a fan of that entertainment is practically compelled from us because, well, shit, what else are we going to talk about on social media 24/7? If the hours you spend watching your favorite TV show don't yield a single hot take about it, then did you ever really watch it? Funko Pops literalize this dynamic by giving a physical form to the otherwise invisible act of entertainment consumption. They allow people to see what it is you like to consume and to make your political identity as a fan be known. The question is, what type of political identity do Funko Pops work in service of creating? Chapter 3, Funko Masculinity. One way to understand any political group is by looking at the objects they surround themselves with and the costumes they wear. There's always a subtext to these aesthetics. There's always a desire for something to be fulfilled. In this way, the Funko Pop is a talisman for new males, the men who've become the face of contemporary liberal masculinity. Funko Pops are the divine statues placed on the secular altars of their owners' living rooms, representing their devotion to the many gods of liberalism and the saints who've been anointed along the way. Like other religious talismans, the Funko Pop serves to ward off evil spirits, and for the new male, the most evil spirit of all is that of toxic masculinity. Having taken full inventory of his white privilege, male privilege, cis-hetero privilege, able-bodied privilege, class privilege, age privilege, look privilege, skinny privilege, and colonial privilege, the new male is now finally ready to raise awareness of starting the dialogue, about making space for having the conversation, to center the discourse, about shutting up and listening, to uplift the voices of other bodies, which is all to say that, like most millennial men, the new male has learned something from the mainstreaming of social justice movements, chastened himself, and is looking for a way to display his newly enlightened views. He's an ally. He's one of the good ones. He's a really nice guy. Funko Pops aid this process by helping to present the new male as being unthreatening. Surely no aggressive, hateful man could be a collector of children's toys, right? In this way, Funko Pops are part of a broader group of soft talismans used to ward off toxicity, along with Nintendo Switch, video game memorabilia, adult Lego sets, Pokemon cards, enamel pins, loot crates, board games, children's anime, and mechanical keyboards. By contrast, the hard talismans the new male collects, things like bacon ephemera, craft beer, plaid button-ups, everyday carries, scented beard oil, these are all made to be a kind of pastiche of traditional masculinity, an ironic nod to the inability of the new male to ever fully conform to traditional masculinity. The ostensible purpose of all these talismans is to help the new male present himself as an ally, but a second look reveals a much different motivation. After all, these are precisely the types of products young Preston Waters surrounds himself with as a boy who suddenly has the grown-up income to buy whatever he wants. The fact that liberals are less threatened by men who have the interest of a 12-year-old is really just an incidental benefit to the true motivation behind these new male talismans, which is to avoid the pain of being an adult, to avoid the pain of cultivating new interests by retreating into childhood comfort, to avoid the conflict with yourself that naturally arises in becoming a man. As millennials say, adulting sure is hard. The question of how to be a liberal man is an oddly unexplored territory given the strong think piece media focus on questioning notions of masculinity. The truth is, no one really seems to know what the ideal version of liberal masculinity is. When I asked people in person, a lot of them said the idea was an oxymoron, or they scrunched their face up like I was asking them some type of impossible ancient riddle. When I put this question out on Instagram, almost no one could think of an ideal archetype, and even fewer could point to writings that talked about the subject in depth. Now, I'm sure if I would have asked people to define toxic masculinity, they could have answered with a million different examples, think pieces, you name it. This imbalance might be due to the long-held tradition on the left of critically positioning yourself in opposition to power, and that as long as people believe masculinity still possesses great power, then there's no way of writing about it in the affirmative sense that wouldn't appear to sympathize with the oppressor. But I think this is a self-defeating perspective that leaves liberal men who earnestly want to better themselves with little more guidance than just be the opposite of Harvey Weinstein. There are obviously plenty of famous men and behaviors to not look up to, but relatively few, if any, men who it's widely agreed possess ideal liberal masculinity. And even in these few contested cases, it's rarely articulated what it is about them that's so ideal beyond their sex appeal alone, which raises the question. If the only encouraged expression of liberal masculinity is the subversion of it, then where does that leave all the men for whom being a dude isn't some kind of meta performance piece about being a dude? And this way, the new male is a kind of negative identity, a hollow placeholder for a person who understands himself for all that he shouldn't be and nothing of what he actually is. As a guy with a degree in fine art, my frustration with the new male doesn't come from believing he's a so-called feminized man in touch with his emotions. Ooh, how scary. My frustration comes from the fact that the new male offers so little in the way of being a person at all. Maybe the reason there isn't an ideal liberal masculinity is because being I'm baby who expresses himself through buying children's toys already fulfills a certain set of liberal ideals. Like I mentioned, the new male is already an ideal consumer of liberal entertainment, flocking to whatever installment of his beloved franchise is coming out next. The new male is already an ideal consumer of liberal media, zealously circulating whatever culture war news story allows him to present himself as one of the good guys who gets it. The new male is already the ideal Democrat voter, eager to support whichever corporate candidate's identity provides him with the best cover from accusations of prejudice. Maybe having a vast reserve of hollow men is an advantage to the political news entertainment industrial complex. Why ruin such a good thing? Conservative pundits look at the question of how to be a man very differently from liberals. If liberals treat masculinity as a boogeyman to be subverted, then conservatives see young men seeking out masculine ideals as a perfect opportunity for impressionable minds to be sculpted in the image of right-wing politics. Conservatives don't shy away from providing young men with practical, social, and philosophical advice for how to be a man, and they've done so through a wide variety of popular media. Conservatives' willingness to openly engage masculinity in this way is basically an uncontested recruitment victory for them, and one of the strongest conversion pipelines they have into creating lifelong Republicans. Obviously, many young men are put off by the whininess of wokeness, but to believe the only reason young men are drawn to the conservative vision of masculinity is because they hate the woke alternative is to misunderstand what is so truly effective about these conservative men's books. The thing that makes something like Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life such a commercial success is the fact that he offers guys advice they can practically implement in their lives to be better men. On the most basic level, telling young men to organize your thoughts, to communicate deliberately, to tell the truth, to work to have a better relationship with your family, to surround yourself with friends who want the best for you, to set incremental goals for yourself. These are all perfectly healthy things for anyone to do. What is conservative about a book like 12 Rules isn't found in its practical advice, but rather in the reasoning behind why that advice should be followed. Telling young men to stand up straight with their shoulders back is a fairly innocuous tip. It only becomes politicized when Peterson legitimizes this advice through a psychotic lobster metaphor that casts humanity as a zero-sum competition for scarce resources, hence the need to think of yourself in a perpetual undersea battle against everyone around you. It's the classic bait and switch, where young men are given normal advice to better themselves that's inevitably tethered to paranoid political ideology. In the mind of the reader, the usefulness of the practical advice is conflated with the truthfulness of Peterson's brand of conservatism. Ultimately, what makes these books so sought out is that there is, at very least, the recognition among these conservative authors that us guys might need a little help. The political project of someone like Peterson is to uplift his downwardly mobile NEET audience from the lower right corner to the upper right corner of this chart, to get them to go from being sullen, self-pitying beta virgins who play video games 12 hours a day in their parents' basement while jacking off to hentai of the Incredibles mom, to becoming a somewhat more well-adjusted trad adult with a steady job, wife, and kids who reliably votes Republican and gets into arguments at PTA meetings about what age his kids should be taught about condoms. That's the glow up. That's the transformative goal. And yes, you probably can get yourself out of your parents' basement just by following these books' self-help advice alone. But the problem is there's a limit to conflating self-help and conservative politics. There is no amount of cleaning your room, bucko, that's going to help you when you're stuck with a $300,000 medical bill thanks to your private health insurance. Yes, people should feel free to start their own family, unless you're trying to do that on 2 incomes earning the current minimum wage and have no public childcare available. The irony is that when it comes to self-help, it's precisely the types of conservative free market trickle-down solutions that make it so difficult for people to help themselves. There's a similarity in the liberal and conservative visions of ideal masculinity, which is that both seem plagued by the inability to represent the present moment. The conservative vision is stuck in a bygone era made impossible to return to en masse, not just because of changing social attitudes, but because conservative politics have made raising a family on a single patriarch's income next to impossible. The liberal vision of perpetually returning to your childhood is less a new masculinity than it is an avoidance of adulthood altogether. Once again, we find ourselves stuck in a nostalgia loop, unable to create new things. It is definitely beyond the scope of a 30-minute video about plastic toys written by a man who dresses up as a clown for a living to offer a totally new vision of what masculinity could or should be. It's been difficult enough for me just to wrap my brain around how to define the current moment, let alone the future. But I will say that conservatives and liberals do agree on one thing when it comes to masculinity, which is to think of strength as being its defining characteristic. For liberals, strength is thought of as a negative trait because it implies the capacity to do violence, to overpower, to harm others. For conservatives, strength is thought of as a positive trait because it aids in the ability to compete, whether that's competition in job markets or for women's attention. These are both wrong in the way they understand strength to be a fundamentally destructive trait, a way to do battle against others. The truth is, strength is a way to create. Strength is the capacity to endure short-term pain in service of a long-term goal. Insofar as the long-term goal of liberal politics is just to maintain the status quo, strength is fairly useless. But in order to buck the traditions of the past in culture, in politics, and in masculinity itself, having the strength to risk creating something new will be all the more necessary.